Hello. I'm going to talk to you today about remembrance. Obviously, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but we remember all those who gave their lives and lost their lives in the course of the First and Second World Wars, and of course those conflicts which followed on after 1945, which sadly are still ongoing in so many parts of the world. Obviously, over 470 of our servicemen and women gave their lives in the recent war in Afghanistan. And it is of course entirely fitting and proper that we do so at this time, to be mindful of the sacrifice which was made on our behalf by our parents, grandparents and great-grandparents. Now, every year for over 50 years I've attended Remembrance Day services and taken part in parades or commemorative events. This year, 2020, will be the first that I, and indeed everybody else, has not been able to do that because of our current circumstances, which we understand all too well. And yet, that does not mean that we should simply skip over this event. We must find other ways, other means to express our thanks, our gratitude to those who served, and whose legacy to us is all of the freedoms which we now enjoy. Free democratic government, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, all these pillars of our democracy which on a day-to-day basis we take pretty much for granted, are their legacy to us. This is what they left us. It is a legacy that we have to cherish, one that we must always maintain against both external and internal threat. And at one level or another, the threat never goes away. And another part of their legacy, equally important, is that certainly my generation and the current young generation have not been called upon to serve in conflict, certainly not in conflicts on the scale of the two world wars. And we must remember that these were titanic conflicts, earth-shaking, earth-forming. Over 10 million people lost their lives in the Great War, and over 50 million in the Second World War. These were industrial wars, wars of the 20th century which pitted competing industrial technologies against each other. Part of the tragedy of the First World War was that perhaps the world's two leading industrial powers, Britain and Germany, were on opposite sides in that conflict. And that meant that these wars of technologies were infinitely more deadly, infinitely more lethal, infinitely bigger than any war or wars which had been fought beforehand. To give you an example, if one of the Duke of Marlborough's redcoats marching along the Bavarian roads to Blenheim in 1704 had seen his grandson or great-grandson marching along the Pavé in Belgium to fight under Wellington at Waterloo in 1850, would have recognised just about everything about his descendant. He still wore the same red coat, he still moved as fast as a man could march or a horse could walk, he carried even the same firearm, the classic brown bess flintlock, which would fire perhaps 2 or 3 rounds a minute and might kill you at 50 yards, not necessarily at any greater distance. If we project forward from Wellington's redcoat, however, 100 years to his great-grandson, marching along the same hot pavé in Belgium in 1914 and 1918, the 19th century soldier would not have recognised anything about his descendant. He wore khaki. He was often carried by trains which could move vast quantities of men and material over almost unimagined distances in a relatively short time. He could be moved across the oceans by steamship. Communications could be made by wireless telegraph. He carried a rapid-firing rifle which could fire perhaps 15 rounds a minute and easily kill you at 600 or 700 meters. The artillery which he used, the quick firers, could pump out a dozen high explosives or shrapnel shells a minute. And the conditions which these new technologies created were worse than anything any previous soldier or generation of soldiers could have hoped to imagine. And as the Great War wore on every year, it became bigger and more terrible. We tend to think of it as being one long saga of mud and blood and trenches and lice and rats. Yes, it was. But every year the struggle became more intense. More and more men were committed. More and more men died. Now, we tend to think of the war as being essentially a male function, and yet Britain could not have won the First World War had it not been for the young women who worked in the munitions factories, particularly after the great shell scandal of 1915. These were the munitionettes, young women who took on jobs previously, mainly done by men, to manufacture munitions. One, perhaps not quite in this region, but in southern Scotland, in Gretna, the Devil's Porridge, employed 30,000 young women. This is a highly dangerous job. There were any numbers of health hazards caused by the dangerous and toxic materials that were being used, and there was a constant risk of explosion. Hundreds of young women died during the course of the war as a result of explosions. Thousands more would suffer life-changing illnesses in consequence. So everyone was involved in this. Children were paid to collect conkers. It's been great to get a shilling a bag for your conkers. The reason being that the conkers contained materials which proofed gas masks, and therefore even young children in this otherwise innocent pastime of picking up conkers were working toward the war effort, and nobody was excluded. Sunderland was bombed in 1916 by Zeppelins, first time that civilian populations had been subject to aerial bombardment. Hartlepool, of course, was bombarded from the sea in December 1914, where over 100 people were killed. So this war, this industrial war, began to reach out to civilians. Of course, in the Second World War, with the Blitz, that was infinitely more terrible. Wearside, as a major manufacturing and shipbuilding centre, was a frequent target for German raids. Hundreds lost their lives in these bombing raids. The amount of damage that was done to infrastructure, to buildings, was intense. And what I'd like to do in the remainder of this short session is to focus on one particular event which involved a large number of Wearside men. And this was the tail end of the Battle of Somme, November 1916, and it involved the attack on a feature called the Butte de Warlancourt. The Butte de Warlancourt was an ancient Iron Age tumulus, a burial mound. It wasn't a man-made hill. Well, it was a man-made hill, it wasn't a natural hill. And of course it was built from the chalk stone of the region. It lay on the, obviously within the German sector, at the southern end of the Somme battlefield, near the Sars. It stood on the straight, long road to Bapaume. This had been one of the British Expeditionary Force early objectives in July 1916 when the Battle of Somme had begun. It was now the 5th of November. This was the day on which 151 Brigade, that is the 6th, 8th and 9th battalions of the Durham Light Infantry, and many of the men in these battalions were Wearsiders, they would attack in an effort to take the Butte. This would be virtually, if not quite, the last gasp in the great battle of the Somme. As I said, the battle had begun on the 1st of July. Since then, at the maximum point of penetration, the Allied lines had advanced 8 miles. This has cost the British Expeditionary Force 420,000 casualties. It cost the French, our allies, 200,000 casualties. By the end of the battle, the Germans would have lost something in the order of 600,000 plus casualties. And the whole line had only moved 8 miles. In the northern sector, from Goncourt south, through Sars, through La Boisselle, Thiepval, there had been no advance. In the southern sector, Mametz, Montauban, Piqueur, there had been some gains at tremendous cost. In November, the Worsening autumn weather meant that the battlefield was becoming impassable, and the notorious Somme mud was making movement, men, guns, material, virtually impossible. But Haig, General Haig, in order to justify his position with the, as we said, largely hostile his hostile political opponents, including Lord George, back in Britain, felt he needed another victory, or something like a victory, which would enable him to claim the Somme battle as an overall Allied success. The target was the Butte de Warlancourt, which by November 1916 had been blasted into a carbuncle of bare white chalk, a carbuncle which the Germans had massively fortified with dugouts, with machine guns, with tunnels. It was effectively a single large bunker with many weapons. In front of it, the Germans had a well-developed trench system shielding the Butte itself. The commanding officer of 151 Brigade was Roland Bradford of the Fighting Bradfords. He and his brother would both win Victoria's Crosses. Roland had already won his Victoria Cross at Beaucourt-l'Abbé in late October 1916. He was a brigadier. He commanded 3 battalions, on paper 3,000 men. He was 24 years of age. He objected to the plan. He was one of that younger generation of officers who were not frightened to voice their dissent. He protested to General Rawlinson that the attack was pointless and suicidal. Even if it was successful, the Butte itself was overlooked by high ground beyond toward Bapaume, which the Germans would still control. Nonetheless, it was decided that the attack would go ahead. 9:10 on the morning of the 5th of November, the Durhams attacked. They attacked in knee-deep mud without artillery support. The ground was too bad to bring up the guns. German fire from their trenches and from the Butte was terrific. Men stumbled and struggled forward, dropping by in scores. And yet the Durhams clawed their way through the initial German trench line and onto the Butte itself. Almost took it, except for one particularly well dug in machine gun position which could enfilade the entire surface of the mound. Throughout that long day, the Durhams clung to their gains. The Germans laid down a curtain of shellfire into no man's land, which was their normal practice to prevent any reinforcements being brought up. Bradford had predicted that this narrow salient the Durhams had created, a bulge in the enemy line, would be subject to relentless counterattacks. And it was. All the way through the afternoon and into the early dusk of November, the Germans relentlessly counterattacked. The Durhams could not be reinforced. Their casualties mounted, their ammunition dwindled, and eventually, at the end of the day, Bradford withdrew the survivors. Hundreds of men had died, hundreds more were injured, and no ground had been taken. And this was just part of the sacrifice which we as side men made during the course of the war. Therefore, I'd ask us that on the 11th hour, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, we stop, observe the 2 minutes silence, and bear in mind the words from the immortal poem by Binion. They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Thank you.